The reading is taken from Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 48. Now when Jesus returned, a group welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowd almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are all crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace."
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. Hi everyone. I'm Kat. I'm married to the gorgeous Shane. Shane, give us a wave. Shane did something a bit radical this week, which I wasn't that keen on. He shaved off his beard. Controversial. Anyway, we'll let that go now. We have two little girls, Ada and Orly. We've been part of St. Mary's since 2010, and it's a great privilege to be here and speak to you guys today. So I'm going to speak on the question Jesus asks in this passage that Stephanie just read for me so beautifully. Thank you. Who touched me? And this is a story that is repeated in Mark 5:24 to 34 and Matthew 9:20 to 22. So it's obviously a story that's got some core importance for us. And I absolutely love this passage. Just afterwards, Jesus goes on to resurrect Jairus' daughter from the dead. And in the middle, we have this kind of miracle within a miracle. Jesus is totally on a roll, isn't he? Miracle, mania, left, right, center. People are getting healed, and it's absolutely nuts. And if we think about the context of the first century, where a minor infection could just lead to you dying, the urgency that people must have felt when they knew that there was someone about who could do miracles and heal you, it must have been insane. It must have been heaving. Can you imagine how many people wanted to be around Jesus, see what he was doing, get healed by him? It would have been a scrummage. It would have been like Beatlemania, but in first century Palestine. So this guy, he might have been the long-awaited Messiah, but frankly, who really cares about that? Because he can heal you. He can heal you. He can raise you from the dead. He can heal you. It must have been madness. There was a furore around Jesus wherever he went, and he was getting mobbed, literally. And I also love this passage because it gets to the heart of Jesus' attitude towards women. And I'm going to be honest with you, I had an anxiety dream about giving this talk last night. I do quite a lot of public speaking. I'm an artist, and somehow that means I end up doing quite a lot of talks. And I'm not normally nervous about public speaking, but last night I had a dream, and in fact, we weren't in this room. All of us were sat in quite a small tent. And everyone was on tiny little chairs, sat very close to me. And it was very claustrophobic, and I thought, oh my God. So I obviously feel a little bit of nervousness about talking about bleeding. And it's funny, isn't it? Because we talk about blood quite a lot in church, don't we? We talk about Jesus' blood, and we're coming up to Easter. And considering how Jesus died in this incredibly torturous, heinous experience, it's very sanitized, isn't it? Like, no offense to Anglicanism or palm crosses, but it's not really a palm cross, is it? Not really. The whole brutality of the way that Jesus was killed is actually at the core of our faith. And it's very messy and unpleasant. We don't often talk about that. But we also never talk about women bleeding. And we never talk about menstruation. I've been a Christian since I was 15. I've never heard anyone do a talk about having a period. Anyone? Anybody in the church ever heard anyone in church do a talk about menstruating? It's crazy. Sorry, I feel like I'm breaking some new ground here, people. You're going to hear a talk about menstruation today. Yes! And I've worn my special red top. Where's Marta? Marta's gone one better. She's got a whole red dress on. We didn't arrange that, but I took it as a word of encouragement when I saw it this morning. Okay, so, I do think as a church, we have obligation to address the issues that face each other. 50% of the people in this room, this is part of our everyday experience. And periods are pretty heavy going, sometimes literally. I woke up this morning, this week, I had a big interview, I started my period. I was just thinking, great. Trying to pitch yourself when you're internally bleeding is not that much fun. Hi, everybody. I've got really quite bad stomach cramps now, but I'm just going to gloss that aside. And I got the commission, thank you, Jesus. But this is for a large proportion of us, this is part of our everyday experience, that we regularly are in pain, and we're just going about our daily life, and no one knows about it. Wombs are pretty amazing, really. We've all come out of one. But they're quite high maintenance as well. Like, every month, shed a whole layer of cells, and that can be quite a lot of blood sometimes. Like, that's quite a lot of maintenance. Do you know what I mean? I feel like God and I might have to have a kind of conversation about this when I finally get to heaven. And they often can be really quite painful. It can be a dull ache, or it can be like a stallion kicking you in the back. And they also sometimes have other fun side effects. Like, I quite often get hormone migraine. Lovely, 2 days beforehand. That's not fun. And for some people, this whole area of health is actually excruciating. 1 in 10 women and people with female reproductive organs get something called endometriosis. 1 in 10. That's quite a number of people in this room, statistically speaking. And for those of you who don't know what endometriosis is, it's where the cells that are the same cells as your womb lining grow outside your womb, and they break down in a similar way to your womb lining, but they do it within your body, and there's nowhere for that blood to go. So you're just in agony. Do you know what the average time from symptoms of endometriosis starting and a diagnosis are in this country? 8 years. 8 years of people being in agony every month, 1 in 10. And do you know what the treatment is for endometriosis when you do finally get your diagnosis while you're in so much pain? Nothing. There isn't a treatment. Maybe you have a hysterectomy that might help. Do you know how many, the same proportion of people that have endometriosis is the same proportion of people that have diabetes? But it's just interesting, isn't it? How much more knowledge there is about issues that don't just affect women or people with female reproductive organs. A dear friend of mine had to have a hysterectomy last year because she'd been bleeding constantly for 2 years. She was so debilitated by it. It was obstructing her everyday life. She was just exhausted. Imagine being this woman in first century Palestine. You didn't have iron supplements. She would have been on her knees. She was dying. She was dying. And I don't know what medical condition she had. But you can imagine how difficult it must have been for her. Jesus, what a flipping feminist radical. Yes. Yes, I flipping love Jesus. Because we also have to remember that this woman's condition wasn't purely medical. It was also spiritual affliction. Because according to the law, God's law, when you're menstruating, you're unclean. So in Leviticus 15:25, it says, if a woman has a flow of blood for many days, thank you, that is unrelated to her menstrual period, or if the blood continues beyond the normal period, she's ceremonially unclean. As during her menstrual period, the woman will be unclean as long as the discharge continues. So, you know, when you had your period, you're unclean anyway. If you had to have a special seat, you can share seats with people and things like that. But imagine being permanently, perpetually unclean. She'd been bleeding for 12 years. She'd been an outcast. She would have been cut off from her community. She was ceremonially unclean. I know a little bit about rejection, but she had a flipping PhD in it. I think rejection is one of the most corrosive things that can happen to a person. It eats away at your sense of self. And it's condemning. The voice of rejection says, you are worthless. But more than that, it says, you make other people worthless. You're an outcast. You're unclean. No one wants to be around you. It's isolating. Can you imagine the profoundness of this woman's isolation? So she's desperate. She's ill. And she was probably nearly dying. And she would have been immensely fatigued. Can you imagine the sort of supernatural strength that she would have needed to get into the crowd, to get through the crowd? And she shouldn't have been anywhere near any of those people. She shouldn't have been touching people. She would have known that she was making everyone that she passed through in that crowd unclean as well. She shouldn't have been there. She should never have been going close to a holy man, let alone the Messiah. Not in a million years. Yet she is so desperate. She is so desperate, she's got nothing to lose. And desperation is one of the most powerful forces. Desperation makes human beings incredibly courageous. Often courage isn't a choice, it's just a lack of options. When you have nothing to lose, nothing can stop you. This is her last chance saloon. This is it. And you can imagine the scene. She's getting close now. She can see Jesus' head a few people away. She can't physically get any closer to him. And she gets down. She gets down, pressing through people's legs so she can touch Jesus. And she doesn't even touch him. In Matthew's account, it says she touched the fringe of his robe. And this is highly significant because this is actually the fringe of his prayer shawl. As an observant first century Jewish man, Jesus would have worn a prayer shawl as described in Numbers 15. They're still worn today. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garment with a blue cord." God loves color symbolism. I love that about him. You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of God, that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by chasing after the lusts of your own hearts and eyes. Then you will remember to obey all of my commands and be consecrated to your God. So these tassels, this prayer shawl, a talit in Hebrew, it is worn as a visual reminder of God's commands. It's a reminder of Leviticus, that passage. It's a reminder of God's law. And she reaches out and she manages to touch this highly symbolic reminder of God's law. And what happens? Does Jesus turn around and be like, Leviticus says you're unclean, get away from me now? No. She managed to reach out and touch the commandments of God, but Jesus, who fulfills the law and the prophets and is the mercy of God made flesh, he doesn't even have a choice. Divine power comes out of him and heals her. Jesus is being jostled by huge numbers of people, and yet he knows this touch, this desperate touch, is different. And the word for power here is dynamin. It's like dynamite. It's specifically miraculous power that flows out of Jesus to this woman and heals her there and then. Anyone can jostle Jesus' shoulder, but desperate people draw miraculous power. So good news, if you're feeling desperate today, good news for you. We can draw a miraculous power from God. And the Hebrew word for the fringe or tassels on the prayer shawl can also mean wings or wing. And in Malachi 4 verse 2, it says that the Son of Righteousness comes with healing in his wings. The woman trembling, shaking. Jesus is like, who's just touched me? The apostles are like, what are you talking about, mate? There's like 10,000 people here all touching you. And Jesus is like, no, someone touched me. And the woman trembling realizes he knows, she knows, he knows. And in front of this whole crowd, all these people who are going to be very upset that they've just been made unclean, she tells her story. She says to him, this is what's happened. And do you know what Jesus says in front of this whole crowd? Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Spiritual, physical, mental peace. That's the power of God. That's the dynamin of God. That's the miraculous power of God. And that's the mercy of Jesus.